And a warning out of Ferndale after false rumors and viral internet posts circulated about a suspicious van driving around that turned out to be a mobile grocery store. Police say false reports were made of children being lured into the van, and they now ask the community to do their research before reporting accusations like that. The repurposed delivery box truck had a valid reseller's permit and was completely within its rights. Police say concerned citizens shouldn't share unfounded rumors on social media before letting officials conduct an investigation.
Wow, what an idea that would be, huh? Stop sharing crap on social media. Well, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you. So, I don't know about how your Thanksgiving is going to go. I'm in Washington State, which is locked down. Been told we're not permitted to have more than 6 people or whatever. We live next door to Oregon, where things are a little bit weirder, gather. Where governor of the great state of Oregon has decreed, Governor Brown has decreed that if you see somebody having Thanksgiving with more people or more stuff, I guess, more households than they should be having, according to her order, she wants people to report them. She wants people to rat them out. In fact, as I understand it, the state of Oregon actually has issued, or at least part of state of Oregon has issued an app, a smartphone app, by which you can anonymously report your neighbors for daring to violate this whole thing and have more people than they're supposed to have for Thanksgiving. Now, a lot of Americans are uncomfortable with this idea because, well, let's face it, it seems very Gestapo-esque. It seems very KGB-esque. It seems very Stasi-esque. It seems kind of like it's something that shouldn't be done because, number one, are we really the kind of people that just rat each other out for that? Are we really those kinds of people? I don't know about Oregon, but possible. And then the question comes up, is this even legal, Dave? I mean, can we do this? And here's the answer to that question. I don't know. I don't know if it's legal in the strictest of senses. I have long argued, you know this, since March I've been arguing that the 10th Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution gives the states the authority to issue states of emergencies, and then those states, individual states, such as Washington or California, have delineated in their constitution and their laws what the powers of government and governors are during those times. I'll be honest, I didn't bother to look up Oregon because I just don't care that much, so I don't know, but I suspect it's similar to the other states, which means that the governors have a great deal of executive authority in the face of an emergency. Of course, the problem is coming in the sense that, well, in the words of one Republican up here, where's the emergency? Where's the actual emergency here? And people are getting tired of this, and it's not going to play well in Peoria much longer. And I think maybe some of these governors are starting to realize it, and Governor Brown's meltdown over, I want people to be turned in, is kind of indicative of that. Whether or not it's legal or not, that's a question for the court system to answer. Whether or not it's a good idea is much easier to answer. It's a horrible idea. It's a stupid idea. It's the kind of idea that only someone drunk on power could possibly come up with. Even if you truly believed that Thanksgiving dinners were an existential threat to your state, county, city, whatever, even if you actually believed that, and for the record, I do not, but if you actually do believe that, there are better ways to convince people, right, that this has to happen. In fact, during the First World War, the government set up an Office of Public Information headed by a guy by the name of George Creel, real name, who told his minions that you got to scare people. You got to convince them that they could die if they don't do what we tell them to do. Well, the only problem with that, of course, is that eventually people either got to start dying or you got to have some sort of miracle cure. In the case of World War I, it was you got to win the war. But the numbers don't support the panic here. It's a bad idea. But it is an idea that has been tried before. It's the thing you need to keep in mind. During the First World War, here in the old United States of America, there was a great deal of controversy about the fight, the war. Now, we don't think in these terms because we have 100 years of historical revisionism, which tells us point blank that the United States was the arsenal of democracy and Britain and France were good, well, Italy too, and Japan. Germany, Austria-Hungary were bad. And while we see it that simply, that wasn't the case in 1914, 15, and 16. In fact, as the United States built towards war in 1917, it really became clear that many Americans did not think that we should go to war. By some counts, as much as 45% of the nation was anti-war. Of course, they had German sympathies, German ancestry, or whatever. There was also a great deal of concern about Eastern European influences in the labor movements, the anarchy movements, and so forth and so on. And so agitation, which delays our war industries, is, quote, made in Germany. Let's all pull together to win the war quickly. Became kind of a rallying call for the United States government, the Office of Information, and so forth and so on. Up until the moment that the United States declared war on Germany in 1917, the arguments were fierce. And the name-calling, it bemuses me that today, people that we don't like, political opponentries, are referred to as Nazis. In 1916, 1917, 1918, 19, they were referred to as Kaiser lovers. There's just something in our makeup that we like to call people Germans. I don't know why, but we do. So this idea of this agitation being problematic because, again, a significant part of the country did not want to go to war. They were not enamored with this. They still had relatives in Germany. They still saw things differently than the history books today. And in fact, were many people at the time, and there are historians today, you will find, who will talk about the fact that the United States' entry into World War I was not based on some moralistic ideology of being the arsenal of democracy or the war to end all wars or anything like that. It was a God-honest fear that if Britain and France lost, we would lose billions upon billions of dollars that we had loaned them that we would never get back. Whereas if they won, well, then they could pay us back. See, we didn't loan the Germans any money because England had a blockade, which was against the rules of war, but we were okay with it because we were giving money and stuff to Britain, selling stuff to Britain, not Germany, so we didn't care. And this upset a lot of people. A lot of people were angry about that. A lot of people were seriously questioning the government's motivation. And even Wilson, up until late 1916, early 1917, kind of saw things in the same way. But at the same time, money talks. ES walks, as they say. This idea of German agitation was deeply held in the United States. If you didn't happen to be of German extraction or German sympathies, you saw a Hun behind every blade of grass. Every demand for a wage increase was seen as German agitation. It was seen as attempting to undermine America. For those who were on the other side of things, reality was a bit different. They saw themselves as loyal Americans, but this Constitution thing over here gives us a right to speak our minds. Or does it? The problem, of course, was there probably were real spies, and there were real agitators. In fact, we know there were. But the Secret Service at the time charged with handling this stuff, and the Department of Justice, or what it was known at that time as the BOI, the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner to the FBI, didn't have enough manpower to actually investigate cases, to clear them or actually prosecute them if they were in fact real spies. So, some rich guy, advertising exec, out in Chicago, hit on an idea. He came up with the idea of what would eventually become the American Protective League, an organization that would be required for some time in the opinion of the Attorney General and the Justice Department, and its job would be to supplement the manpower on a volunteer basis. Supplement the manpower of the OBI and the Secret Service by going out investigating people who might be German agitators. And indeed, they began to look into questions of sedition. Have them checked by Uncle Sam when individuals came under the eyes of the Secret Service. The American Protective League would go out and look at things. They would hit the trails of slackers. United States Marshal registers nearly 5,000 enemy aliens as a war regulation. These volunteers would go out and look to investigate these people. Now, again, they're volunteers. They are not actual agents. They're people who wandered in, signed up, got a badge that said American Protective League, Secrets, United States Secret Service on it, and were essentially sent out with carte blanche to investigate any questionable activity by people, slackers, what we would call draft dodgers today, left-wing labor, political organizations, radicals, anarchists, anti-war activists, of which there were many in that time frame. You think the 60s were anti-war. Yeah, you should go back to 1917, 1918. At any rate, these volunteers with these badges would go out and investigate these people for their criminal activity, which may have been as little as saying, ja, ich spreche Deutsch. Us. So there were upwards of some 250,000 that they know of these American Protective League agents. Possibly as high as 1 million. The records are not as clean as you would like them to be, but at least they can definitively say that there were 250,000 of these agents, an air quote thing there, in 600 American cities. Again, investigating slackers, left-wing political agencies, radicals, anarchists, and those anti-war activists, as it were. No, they would cast the net out for spies. Nationwide secret society formed at outbreak of war, defeats Germany's great spy system. This was an article from later in the war when, well, we'll get there in the story. That slide should probably be later on. No one was above suspicion. This article actually comes from a newspaper of the day. No man was so high or so low in wealth or social position that there was not the opportunity to investigate him without his being aware of it, if he was under suspicion as to his loyalty. Now, just imagine what kind of things would get your loyalty suspected. In 2020 Oregon, maybe you have 7 people for Thanksgiving. Suppose a man of wealth, it goes on, of German descent and sympathies were suspected. He was possibly a member of a club, prominent in the financial and business circles of his community. An ordinary detective would find much difficulty in getting the truth about the man, but another banker or merchant or professional man who did business with him could find out all about his sympathies, considerable about his activities, without in the least bit arousing his suspicions. No one was above suspicion. No one. In the eyes of the APL, these 250,000 agents, they carried badges, folks, of the Secret Service, and the OBI, the predecessor to the FBI, who would essentially see something and decide that they would investigate it. What if you had German books on your shelf? Would you be suspect? What if you had, I don't know, what if you liked schnitzel? Or German sausages for breakfast? What if you liked German beer? Well, then could be a problem there, couldn't there? No one was above suspicion. And in fact, at one point, the APL joined with the OBI. And in New York City, over the course of 3 days, they stopped, detained, and searched 75,000 men, whom they arrested. 75,000 men over 3 days in New York City. What were they arrested for? Well, maybe they weren't carrying their registration cards, or maybe they had a German name or something. In the end, less than 400 of those men were actually found guilty of anything. But that didn't matter. It was a roundup, 75,000 men arrested, and it happened. And again, this wasn't 1940 Berlin, wasn't 1950 Moscow, or 1965 East Germany. This was the United States of America in 1917, folks. This was us. Later on, after the war ended, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not they should keep this organization or not, because, there were still Bolsheviks, and there were still loyalists, and there were still trades unionists and the likes of that, agitators, and we need to know what to do. And so there was a discussion about whether or not they should keep doing this. And what you need to understand is the whole time they were doing this, with the help and support of the OBI and the Secret Service, they were getting information from the United States government. Oh, look, here's somebody we'd like investigated, the government would say, and they would hand the files off to the local office of the APL, and the APL would go dig, go investigate, go harass. Imagine that. The government would essentially sick the APL on people. What crime did they commit? Towards the end of this whole thing, the debate after the war had ended, there was a lot of debate about whether they should keep them around. And a guy by the name of Huff, Emerson Huff, who was at that time a world-famous writer of Western novels. He was seen as not just a good writer, he was seen as very loyal, and he was asked to put together the official history of the APL, and to do so in a way that would encourage the government to maintain the services of the APL. So he wrote a book called The Web, which you can still get today. You can go on Amazon and find it. It's expensive, but you can get it. It's easier just to find it in newspapers and the likes of that from that era and read it there. But he wrote this book. It's the official history of the APL. And of course, it's glowing as to what they did. The New York Times reviewed the book, said, quote, "There are many reasons why every man and woman in the whole country ought to know the full story of the APL's work. For if they are good Americans already, it will make them still better ones, will stimulate their pride and loyalty. But if they are not good Americans, it will put the fear of God into their hearts." That's the actual New York Times review of the book, The Web, the story of the APL. Again, not the Gestapo, not the KGB, not the Stasi. This is the United States of America, folks, by this point in 1919, 1920. Reporting neighbors, turning people in. It was a mess. What the government ultimately decided, well, there were two factors that decided it. First, there was an assistant secretary of labor. He was not the secretary of labor. He was not a member of the cabinet. He was an assistant secretary of labor who was in charge of some things, and he was told by the APL people that he needed to fire a bunch of folks who were under suspicion. They hadn't actually done anything. They were under suspicion. He was ordered by the APL to fire him, and he basically said, "To you, And the APL went nuts. Congress went nuts. Congress hauled this guy in before them, his assistant secretary, and just grilled him. And the contemporary news reports of the day are he basically bitch slapped Congress. By the time it was over, Congress was on its feet applauding this guy, going, no, you're right. You got to defend people's rights. This whole APL thing is a bad idea. He was the Secretary of, I think it was Commerce, wanted the Secretary of Treasury to fire him at the cabinet meeting. They had a very frank and direct cabinet meeting at which the Secretary of Labor was leaned upon by all the other secretaries to fire this guy. And the President Wilson, to his credit, basically said, no, don't do that. That's not going to help the situation any at all. And it wouldn't have. The second item that really saw the death knell of the APL as an organization was they got a new attorney general, a guy by the name of Palmer, who would actually go on to do some dumb things. But at the time, he came in and he absolutely refused to continue a professional relationship, an official relationship with the APL. He said that the APL materials were, quote, gossip, hearsay information, conclusions, and inferences. He also added that, quote, information of this character could not be used without danger of doing serious wrong to individuals who were probably innocent, unquote. Later, in 1919, Congress and the press were urging him to reinstate the Justice Department's wartime relationship. He told reporters, quote, its operation in any community constitutes a grave menace. And he was right. He was absolutely right. This idea of turning in of having citizen investigators who would not be bound by oaths or anything else was proving to be problematic. 75,000 arrests, 400 actual charges. But people were so ludicrously insane about this idea of German agitation and anarchy and all this sort of thing. Look, like George Creel said, they were scared. And when you can scare people into believing there's an existential threat, well, to borrow from Montesquieu, when you can convince people of absurdities, you can convince them to commit atrocities. And here in the United States of America, we began to do that. After the war was over, after everything had settled down, and after it was clear that the APL was going to disband because it was not needed by the government, it wouldn't be used by the government anymore, other organizations began to seek out the APL memberships list. In the 1920s, the KKK heavily recruited from the membership lists of the APL. That should tell you a lot right there. J. Edgar Hoover, in the nascent days of the FBI, continued to use reports and personnel from APL memberships in his investigations, quote unquote, of people that he thought he should go after. It was a grave menace, and it continued to be a grave menace. And this idea of reporting on each other because we suspect you, j'accuse, is a bad idea, but it's still back, isn't it? Governor Brown has decided now to see it through again. But it makes me wonder, because do we really need, do you really need to report on your neighbors? We live in a world of social media where literally everything we eat, drink, say gets put on social media. All the government's got to do is look at it and go, well, look, here's a picture of so-and-so and 16 of his best friends. That's illegal. As long as we're going to self-report ourselves anyway, do we really need an app or the state of Oregon to do this? It's going to be interesting to me to see how Oregon reacts to this, to see what Oregonians do. Will be fascinating to me. I suspect that there will be a good deal of tomfoolery with the app. I suspect that there will be a good deal of refusal. I know that we've had multiple law enforcement agencies around the country that have told governors and powers that be that we're not doing. Stanislaus County, where I used to live, the sheriff down there put out a brilliant letter saying we're not we're not going to go do this. Sorry. We got actual work to do. Real stuff that actually needs to be done. We're not going to do that. Problem is, of course, that there are some law enforcement agencies. It's not every law enforcement agency has said that. There are some that have said or implied or at least allowed to be believed that they will continue to enforce this nonsense, which may or may not be constitutional. It may or may not be legal. We don't know yet. What we do know is that no matter where you turn, Big Brother is always watching.